Hi everybody, and welcome to this next Azure webinar. This time we're going to be talking about conscious leadership and how conscious leaders can be the architects of a better world. So you're very welcome. I'm sure there will be others joining us as we go on, but let's get underway. We are recording the session, so if you do choose to make a contribution, a couple of points we've got for questions and so on, or discussion, then please just be aware of that. And if I can also invite you to use the chat as much as you would like to. So if I say anything or put any thoughts up that you want to engage with or put your own perspective on, please do use the chat because that's a great way of staying involved in the session as we go through. So welcome to everybody, and let's get underway. My name's Lorraine Flower and I'm part of the Azure Conscious Leadership and Organizational Development Consultancy. We are very focused on helping organizations and leaders to think a little bit more broadly, perhaps a little bit more deeply about what their leadership is bringing to an organization and also what the organization is bringing to the world. And we use a whole range of different bridges and connection points to try and open up those conversations. As you can imagine, it's not always a straightforward process, but we're very happy to be bringing this very open and transparent webinar to you today as we get more deeply into the principles of consciousness. As I said, there is the chat facility, and I do encourage you to use that as we go through. So I'd like to start by offering a thought from actually McKinsey, and it struck us quite strongly when it came out. Not, McKinsey says a lot of things. It's not really to do with McKinsey per se, but it was quite a succinct way of introducing this idea of choice. And when we start to think about consciousness, that's a place we have to think about. So where the world lands is a matter of choice, of countless decisions to be made by individuals, companies, governments, and institutions. Accessing our consciousness means that we start to become aware of choices we're making, and we take ownership and responsibility for those choices in a very clear and fundamental way. As far as we're concerned, whether we're conscious of it or not, whether we're aware of it or not, we are currently in a time where conscious and emergent choice making is really very much the name of the game. And that demands courage, and it demands that we stop and take a look at the things that we are seeing, the things that we're doing, the things that we're thinking and feeling, and reflect on our choices, reflect on those choices both in the past sense, particularly with this very strange time, but very powerful time that we're living through at the moment, partly through the pandemic, but through other things that are going on as well. And reflect on those choices that have been made in the past, but also commit ourselves to making good choices going forward. And choice is a tough word to put on the table because it's something that sometimes we can rail against because we feel powerless or we feel like we're caught in something that's so much bigger than us. And yet we are the us, we're it, we're everything. And therefore, as individuals, we have to reclaim our sense of power in that process. And that comes to leadership, both in the hierarchical organizational sense, but also in the inner sense, in that inner leadership, that sense of individual and personal responsibility. And today we want to explore the qualities that we've been working on, that we've been developing into a package. They're not qualities that we own, they're just things that we have identified that seem to be really key in helping us as leaders, or focusing us as leaders on how we play our part in that choice making and how we play our part in our own organizations as well. And when we think about leadership, there are hundreds of ways in which we can define it, and many an academic tome that will talk about the different aspects of leadership. What we're really looking to bring onto the table here today is leadership qualities and who we are as people and how we behave, how we bring ourselves into the equation, into the world, and into the different choices and decisions that need to be made. It's probably fair to say that from a leadership point of view, we have to see our role as a creative role. It's not one that is passive, it's not one that is leaving us with being at the kind of beck and call, at least it shouldn't be. And it is something that we are actually very much impacted by, as well as making those changes as we go through. So this quote from John Shah, which we use a lot, and those of you who've joined us before will have seen us use it, is very profound, we feel. Future is not some place we're going to, but one we are creating. So we are co-creators in our reality. The paths are not to be found, but made. So every act we have, every act we make, everything that we think, everything we do is creating that future reality, that current reality. But the activity of making them, so that engaging in leadership, being part of that leadership, is what changes both us as the leader and the ultimate destination. So we are very connected with the destination that we choose. And thank you for the comments that are coming through in the chat already. Please do keep those coming. So we are very much involved in what is going on. We're not bystanders, we're not watching, it may feel that way, but that doesn't have to be that way if we connect with something more within ourselves. And this is another quote that, again, in many ways sums up a lot of what we're talking about when we think about conscious leadership. The 7 generations forward, 7 generations back is something very much associated with the native Indian community. But if we think about that and we think about our responsibility to draw the best from what has gone before, because when we look to the future, it isn't always about rubbishing the past, it's about recognizing the positives, the sacredness, the holiness, the strength, if you will, in all of those choices and decisions that have been made in the past, and the good things that have come, values, the good principles that have been part of that, those previous generations' choices and decisions, and then work out how do we build on that and take the good forward when we're thinking about all of those generations that will come after us and our responsibility in that process, which very much speaks to this place of co-creativity. So I'd like to just share a little bit about our journey today, having kind of opened up the idea of consciousness and where we may be going with that. I think firstly, we probably need to spend a little bit of time just looking at this thing called consciousness. It's a word we use a lot, certainly in Azure, and it can mean many things at many different levels. So just want to open that up a little bit, and that may stimulate some thoughts and other perspectives from your point of view. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at why is conscious leadership needed now, what is that, and how does it relate to the world that we're in at this point in time. And then we want to share with you the results of the research work we've been doing, which is to share 5 attributes or qualities within what we call conscious leadership, and maybe the archetypal conscious leader, putting it up there for you to think about, reflect on, and consider its relevance to you and your own organisation. So before we go into exploring consciousness, I'd like to invite you on this Friday morning, well, it is here in the UK, on this Friday, to just take a few moments and bring yourself into a place of inner quiet. Now, some of you may have started your day with some mindfulness, maybe some meditation, maybe some reflection, maybe a walk where you've been able to connect with something a little bit deeper within yourself. But let's just take a moment now and just a couple of deep breaths. And as we release those breaths, let us just allow ourselves to come into an inner place of calm and an inner place of quiet. Just become very present with ourselves. Allow that in breath and out breath to bring us to that inner place, that quiet place, that connected place. So thank you for participating in that just moment of silence that holds so much. Silence is everything, as well as that sense of emptiness that we can connect into as well. So let's start our exploration of consciousness. And I'm going to share with you a couple of different quotes that each of them bring perhaps a different perspective on consciousness. This one is potentially quite esoteric. It comes certainly from esoteric teachings, spiritual teachings, if you will, but it's actually a very powerful expression of consciousness, if we think about it in very everyday terms. The power to be fully aware of all happenings in all spheres and departments of man's being during the entire 24 hours of the day. So that's setting the bar really high. Imagine if we were able to be in a space where we had really full awareness. We were really connected, firstly with ourselves, our physicality, our emotionality, our thinking, what's going on in our mind. And then also on a broader level, energetically, perhaps on a higher level of connection. But we were doing that not just occasionally, not just when we sat down to reflect or meditate or participate in some mindfulness, but that was really present with us all the time. And we could really feel ourselves connected into the universe, the earth, and also fellow human beings on an energetic level. Imagine that. It kind of blows my mind. But it's something that we can strive towards. It's that aspirational part of consciousness. Here's one that's by Albert Einstein, and many will have come across this before. It's one that's often shared, but I think again it offers a slightly different perspective and encourages us to recognize that as human beings we do tend to separate ourselves. We do tend to bring ourselves away from the rest of humanity in many ways, and also from the rest of the living world. And yet that's a delusion. It's not true. We are connected, and we see that through this current pandemic. You know, if we ever needed a lesson in the interconnectedness of all life, the pandemic is showing that to us, that we are interdependent in a very physical, practical way, but also that there's something else that's going on here, that connectedness that we have through the love and the support that we share with each other, with the fact that we're all in a similar boat, except it's not the same boat for everybody, but similar, and that we're all perhaps in this moment having some access to a common experience. So we're not separated. And as Einstein says, our task must be to bring ourselves out of that prison and to separate ourselves from this idea of separation and bring ourselves into connection. And we can do that by widening our circle of compassion. So that's one way of stepping ourselves into consciousness. And just looking at a couple of the comments in the chat, would the level of consciousness, that 24-hour ever-present consciousness, be the opposite of being truly focused? I don't see it as the opposite of that. I see it as a different type of focus. So it is focused, but it's kind of like a soft focus. It's holding an awareness and almost like a lens, a soft lens that allows us to be in a more subtle space. So subtle is a word I would use in that space of 24-hour consciousness. So another way of looking at consciousness, and another dimension on it, if you will. So many of you will be familiar with perhaps Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this is a model that has been developed by Richard Barrett, who's particularly looked at the values within an organization. And we're not going to talk about organizations particularly today. If you're interested in the soul of business, that's our final webinar for this year, so that'll be in December. Before that, we'll be looking at economy, just to bring another dimension, conscious economy. So anyway, those are for the future, but for today, looking at the another way of thinking about levels of consciousness. How are we connected into our own point of focus, to pick up the word in the chat? And Maslow's hierarchy works on the principle that as we become more able to take care of our immediate needs, survival needs particularly, we can then start to make our way up the triangle and into a higher level of personal growth and personal fulfillment. And Richard Barrett has taken that and extended it slightly further. So there were 5 levels with Maslow, he's created 7. But the point here really is that as we think about where our focus is, we can start to have some sort of sense of where our consciousness is. So if we're below the point, the level 4 in this, we're probably more focused on me, myself, I. So where am I at in my life? What am I doing? How am I, are my family safe? Are things going on that mean that we can stay in a good, healthy space? Am I getting to do some of the things that my talents allow me to do? And that's great. That's absolutely great. And that will always be needed. Those foundations don't go away. But as we grow internally, as we expand our awareness and consciousness and move higher into our sense of self, not from an outer ego point of view, but from an inner soul point of view, we can start to move into a different expression of who we are. And we start to look for things like meaning, and we start to connect with a broader relationship with our world, both human, animal, plant, mineral, and universal. And I think opening up to that broader level of what ultimately at level 7 is service is something that says, actually, not that I don't matter, of course, we still have to take care of the everyday physical things, but that actually the world matters a whole lot more, and I can contribute into the world in a way that means my needs are much less, but actually I can give my talents over to something bigger than me. So there's a good amount of conversation going on in the chat. Thank you for that. And yes, Alex, of course you're right that there are issues around showing vulnerability, and people are tending perhaps to come further down these levels of consciousness, come back to protection and armoring and making sure that we're not in danger. And this is where consciousness is so important, because it's not about being the words escaped me. It's not about being taking lots of risks. It's not about kind of just throwing all caution to the wind. Of course, we have to remain sensible, and we have to recognize those steps that need to be taken and protect other people in that process as well. But actually, it's about being able to recognize that there is something bigger that we can connect into, that we can also draw support from. So this is another way of thinking about conscious. Where is my attention? Where am I focused? Am I completely absorbed with my own needs and my own sense of self? Or am I starting to move my awareness into something that has a higher level of meaning and a higher level of connection? When we also start to think about how consciousness is expressed, you'll have heard me using a bit of language here, and some of it may have been comfortable and some of it may not have been comfortable. There's many ways in which we can start to think about this way of consciousness. Certainly, I would tend to connect it with the soul, with the sense of that higher self, that higher awareness and wisdom that sits within us. And so higher self is another word. Higher mind, that sense of not the intellectual, analytical mind that we use, but a higher sense of awareness that allows us to process things in a more abstract way in the higher mind. Mindfulness, of course, is also something we might associate with consciousness, as is meditation. Beingness is a word we hear quite a lot in this space as well. That sense of coming into our true sense of self. Jackie, thank you. Yes, part of the role of leaders is to grow into their true selves. And we access that when we are prepared to truly find that inner beingness, that inner presence, that inner sense of self. And for any who are maybe on this session thinking, my goodness, this is all a little bit too esoteric, a little bit too out there, and not really relevant to the organizational space. In fact, it is. In fact, it's something that is fundamental to the organizational space. And when we think about all of these organizations, very familiar names, all of them, most of them, I imagine, to us, they all have something in common. And the thing they have in common is that they have all participated in and offer in various ways programs of mindfulness and meditation within their organizations. Now, they'll have different motivations for doing it, and for some there's maybe getting on a bandwagon, for others there's a fundamental and deep connection with the value that mindfulness brings. Certainly in Silicon Valley, where it has been particularly broadly used, there's a sense that it connects us into a deeper creativity. And if we go back to one of our earlier quotes about the role of leaders and our need to be co-creative, tapping into our role in being co-creative, that everything we do is creating a new reality, is creating our current reality and the reality for others if we're in a leadership position, then becoming more aware of that is really important. And there's a lot of evidence around that building collective consciousness individually as leaders and then collectively can have quite significant impacts. And for those of us who are very connected into meditation and mindfulness and consciousness, we probably don't need this sort of data, but actually it's useful. This type of research, this type of evidence is useful in helping to bring leadership into a space where it's maybe more open to going into some of that inner growth, not just the outer skills growth. So the experiments that Rotterdam's Erasmus University conducted showed that meditators generated 22% wider range of ideas than non-meditating groups. So back to that creativity point. The Maharishi effect, many of us may have heard of that. And there's evidence of that through scientific studies where by groups meditating together and at scale, it does actually have an impact in creating a higher level of harmony across the world. And there are many projects in these days that have grown exponentially of large groups of people meditating together in order to bring into play a higher level of, a higher quality level of existence for the whole of humanity and for the whole of living existence. So I'm just going to pause for a second and offer this question. If you feel like you want to make a verbal contribution, feel free. You can unmute your microphone, so certainly that's a possibility. If it's something you'd like to say something more about in the chat, then feel free to do that. But I've offered a few perspectives on consciousness, and I'm just curious about what it might mean to you if we stop being sleepy. So let's develop this a little bit further then. And I said we'd speak a little bit about the current circumstance, and I don't need to labour too much around the pandemic. I'm sure we've all said a lot around that, but there's a couple of things that I do want to bring in contextually that I think are also important for us to think about. And the world of organisational life, business life, may not feel like an easy bedfellow for some of the conversation we're having in this session, and yet there is a recognition, there's a growing recognition, not everywhere yet, but there's a growing recognition that change is needed amongst business leaders. And Klaus Schwab is the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. We've referenced that before in this, these webinars, and it's not necessarily a place that is always on message, but actually there are some quite useful things that come out of it. And Klaus Schwab said in a recent economic forum that our ability to secure inclusive growth and preserve our scarce resources puts multiple global systems at risk simultaneously. Our first response must be to develop new models of cooperation that are not based on narrow interests, but on the destiny of humanity as a whole. And that is starting to open up this question of leadership responsibility, of individual responsibility, of course, as well, and recognizing this on a level that is much more systemic in the sense of the role of organizations to play their part, an active part in that. And here at Azure, we perhaps sometimes naively or idealistically believe that organizations have a fundamental place in creating our new world, perhaps even more so than governments and organizations, governments and social organizations. So thinking about timing and time, one of the questions that we think is important to think about is what is the level of shift that we're being asked to engage in? What is it that we need to be thinking about at this time when, and I think that it is this time, and that's not to say there haven't always been relevant times to make a shift, but there's a huge coalescence at this point in time. And if we're not to waste this opportunity, and in fact I don't think we'll be given the opportunity to waste it, but if we're not to waste it, we have to think about how can we start to cooperate with the level of shift that might be needed. And it is on a pretty vast scale. You know, we can look at things like the fact that the airline industry which is a former industry I was very intimately involved in as an employee, is going to have to shrink in size. And we can, you know, be sad about the fact that we're not going to get on our holidays and do those sorts of things that we wanted to do and have enjoyed doing, but actually look at the cost of all of that in environmental terms. When we think about the biggest threat facing humanity, we know that that is about the climate change and the fundamental sustainability of this planet. And for some people that will seem like an over-dramatization, and I truly get that. But we only have to look at fires, floods, pandemics, financial crashes, the shifts in our climate stability. I'm not a big Bible reader. I was brought up a Catholic. I do have, you know, some tentacles back into that space, but it's actually, we can see in past history that there have been other times when this type of cataclysm has come into human awareness and consciousness. And the question is, what choices can we be making at this time that might enable us to actually participate in a very different future, not just even about stabilizing, but in fundamentally transforming the way that we live in our world and the way that we live in a more harmonious way with all aspects of our planet, with all and not just the planet, but beyond that. You think about the amount of rubbish that we are placing out into the cosmos, and, you know, without a care, without a thought. Yes, we need certain things to exist, but if we can shift our consciousness, we will need things a lot less. Back to the World Economic Forum, and again, I'm not promoting it as a fantastic place, but there are some encouraging signs of the scope of discussion, the things that are coming up, the things that they are starting to put onto the table. And we can be cynical and argue that maybe that's from a place of self-interest and still focused on profit, but there is a sense of a shift starting to happen, and there is a sense in which things are moving into a broader perspective, not just a self-interest perspective. Of course, the United Nations has been on this trail for a long time, And these Sustainable Development Goals are also finding their way back into not just the NGO space or the charity space or the do-gooder space, but are fundamentally starting to come onto the agenda as areas where we need to be paying attention as a system, as a collective, businesses, organizations, leaders, governments, nations, on every level. And that's something that, that we can all start to pay attention to. Pick one of these areas for our organization or for our leadership that we can play a bigger part in the transformation of. And a group of leaders, again, under the auspices of the World Economic Forum, brought together a compact, as they called it, a roadmap for sustainable long-term growth and opportunity. Now, still thinking about the sustainability of organizations, but having somewhat broadened that out into the more altruistic space of a global well-being, as opposed to just individual profit. So let's bring this then into the leadership space. If we accept, and I'm not suggesting you do, but if we accept that there is a bit of a shift going on and that is starting to make a change. Catherine, thank you. You've picked up on the fact that there's been a shift, greater focus on organizational purpose and what that really means. Sorry. I'm done with my slides too far. That's actually something that we're also observing, that there is at least a growing sense of needing to not just go through the motions of thinking about things like vision and purpose, but actually starting to have meaningful conversations about what that really means. Alex, you're speaking about ethical funds. Yes, they were the hardest to sell, I'm sure, but actually there's quite a lot of research that shows that those people who are investment bankers are particularly starting to shift some of the actions of non-ethical businesses by investing away from them. So the power is growing in that field too. So let's bring this to leadership then and think about that in more specific terms. And this is a quote from Frederic Laloux, again, something we've referred to before in terms of his work on reinventing organizations. And he says, and something I can certainly see a lot of truth in, which is that when we think about organizations, the level of consciousness in an organization cannot exceed the level of consciousness of its leader or senior leaders. And I think that's certainly true. In 40 years of working in the business world and the organizational world, I have to say that if the leader, individual or that sort of board or collective leadership team, if they're not prepared to demonstrate the courage to shift their mindset, whether that's prompted from the outside or from one of the people in the organization, or because they found their own way to it through their own personal journey, they're not prepared to shift their consciousness level, it contains the whole organization at whatever the level of consciousness is of that leader. So the responsibility on leadership is very, very key. So we'd like to share with you some of the conscious leader qualities, and you'll see in the background here a deck of cards, and we've constructed a set of cards that contain the qualities that I'm just about to share with you. And what we've done within that is express some of the principles we believe that underpin the 5 leadership qualities that we're about to explore, and also some questions and sort of coaching resource for people who want to find out a little bit more about how they can develop that aspect of consciousness. These qualities that we're about to share with you are as a result of a lifetime of leadership experience, personal and others. So not just mine, but across a wide variety of contributors. We've of course looked at various academic texts and spiritual texts as well. We've had the input from many conscious leaders, both through seminars and workshops, but also through research that we have been conducting over 20 years now, 25 years in this space. And over the last 5 years, we've been blogging around these 5 qualities and getting feedback and input on them from a kind of relatively small group, about 45 people, who have contributed to the thinking as we've gone along. So we like to think they've got a little bit of credibility, but again, interested in what you think as we go through. So 5 qualities, as I said. Alex, to come back to you on those cards, there's definitely a way of getting hold of them. So we're not sending them out in PDFs, but we have got hard copies of them. So let's connect afterwards around that. But for now, let's look at these 5 qualities. And again, they may at times feel a little bit abstract, and I'll do my best to make them feel as tangible as possible. Purpose, been a bit of chat around that already today, and yes, a leader who is connected to a deeper sense of their own reason for being and how they contribute to the greater good. A purpose that is informed by that is what we would find in someone who we might classify as a kind of more conscious leader. Heartfulness, of course, you'd imagine would be part of this this scope, and being able to act from that place of loving wisdom, kindness and compassion and courage. So again, we can tend to think about heart as being something that is very soft and fluffy, but it's not. It's got a very powerful edge to it. It requires a lot of courage to keep acting from that place of the heart, and to keep the heart open in a time when it's particularly under a lot of pressure and challenge through others' behaviours or through the external environment. And how we make sense of that through the heart is also a key thing. Intention is the 3rd quality that we identified, and that's about being able to be really aware, coming back to this point about consciousness, really aware of how our thoughts and actions play out in the world. So the principle of cause and effect sits very deeply in our ability to hold a higher level of intention and actually see that through beyond our wildest dreams, often in the actions that we can put out into the world. Knowing, which we might also have used the word intuition, but it's something even more than that. One of the challenges with the word intuition is that people tend to only relate that to sort of that gut instinct, and intuition is so much more than that. It is very much a deeper connection with that higher self and what we might call the soul. And then the 5th quality is presence, where we start to think about that sense of how we show up when we're in a room, when we're connected with other people. What is that comes forward from us? And we use that, we use language like inner grace and an essence that comes from being able to hold that space of centeredness, that awareness, that aliveness that we were talking about earlier in the context of defining consciousness. So I'm going to whiz us through the 5 areas, in 5 qualities in reasonable pace, but just so that we can get a slightly deeper sense of them. On the left-hand side of each of these slides, you'll see one of the cards. There are 6 cards in each quality, and each of the cards has an area of the particular quality to explore. So I'm only showing you the first card in each deck, but the qualities or the subsets of those I've summarized into these 5 areas in each card, and they're slightly different, of course. So with purpose, I think we probably all have a reasonably good understanding of it, but what I would say in the conscious leadership space is that it's a sense of purpose that is focused on service and a better world for all. So if we go back to the Barrett continuum that I showed you based on Maslow, it's that being really connected with a sense of service and being able to see that we have a part to play in a better world for all, and defining our own purpose in a way that is very much connected to that and driven by that. And it has a much bigger picture focus. So we've expanded our horizon, hence our picture of the sky, and this sort of point of the comet or the shooting star is that there is this sense of something much higher, much more vast, much wider in the way that we're defining our sense of purpose, and something that actually pulls us on in a very magnetic and powerful way. Heart is, yes, about love and compassion, but it's about being able to do that for ourselves, towards ourselves, because if we aren't truly able to show our own individual self love and compassion, it's very difficult to be authentic with others in that space also. It is about being connected with passion, and passion's an interesting word also to bring into the kind of leadership space, because it kind of send people a little bit wobbly, but of course we're not talking about sexual passion, we're talking about that creative passion, that living energy, that fiery energy that allows us to be part of the creative process and participate in something much bigger than ourselves. It is about being able to think through the heart, so allowing the heart to be part of our thinking process. And yeah, Michelle, yeah, drive as well, of course, it's another word for it. It's that real connectedness, back to your word of livingness and aliveness, which was so powerful. And it is about having an appreciation for beauty. When we're really connected with the heart, we really connect into beauty, and we start to have a different sense of joy. So instead of talking about things like happiness, which is important too, but is more transitory, joy is a much deeper felt sense, and it's something that has a much broader radiatory quality within us as people and as leaders. Intention, as I said, this is about how we actually manifest to some degree in the world. And it's about being able to see things from a much more holistic perspective, a whole systems view. But it's also being aware of the principle of cause and effect. So recognizing that as we think, so it is. That's true for us individually, but it's also true for the thoughts we put out into the world. So if we're putting frustrated, toxic, or blame-oriented or aggressive or angry thoughts and feelings out into the world, that is populating the field, the energetic field. So being aware and using wisdom in how we think our thoughts, what those thoughts are, the things we say, the way we behave, this is all part of a higher level of intention and being connected on a much more fundamental level. Knowing, as I said, we could perhaps have called that intuition, but we see them as slightly different, well, partly because the language gets used slightly differently. But knowing, I don't know if any of you have ever had this sense, but that sense of real, deep trusting of something that you believe to be true. And it's not that sort of following others credo. It's not about needing to sign up to something that might feel a little bit cultish. It's about a fundamental sense of knowing something within yourself that you hold to be true, and it's clean. It's clean. It's not affected by psychological pressures from growing up or any of those other things, or societal pressures. It's a really deep sense of, yeah, I know this is true in myself, and that knowing is incredibly powerful and incredibly resourcing as well. It taps us into what we've called here a universal wisdom, so something that is bigger than ourselves. We go beyond our own little self and into something bigger, and we focus on developing wisdom more than knowledge or intelligence. It's more about wisdom. How do we connect into something that has a broader value? And the final one we've called presence, and that's that, in a sense, bringing all of this together into that awareness in every moment, that being able to show up with that inner stillness, and still be able to act in the world. So this isn't about heading off to somewhere beautiful and sitting on the top of a hill and meditating forever, much as that might feel appealing for some of us in this day and age. But it's about being able to hold that inner space, that sense of being in that beautiful, quiet, reflective space, and still participating in the world in a very real and meaningful way, and doing that with that inner stillness being very much evident and present with others, and that we see ourselves as playing our part in safeguarding the future. So I've gone through those at quite a pace, and conscious that we only have a few minutes left in our time, I want to give a chance to open up the conversation as well. So I'm just going to finish off a couple of other thoughts, and then I want to open it up for the last couple of minutes. You'll have noticed, I hope, or maybe not, as I've been going through this, I've been trying to find language that is both of the more kind of subtle, the more intangible perhaps space, the harder to define, I think, as Jackie said in one of her contributions. It is hard to define, but it's also a very powerful way of drawing people into what we might mean by consciousness, and how we say things can actually affect the impact that we have on other people as well. So these are a few words that could replace some of the other language that we use in an organizational sense, a leadership sense. Illumination has a very broad sense of opening up new light, bringing in new awareness, new understanding. Prosperity rather than profit, perhaps, where we're thinking about a wider definition of well-being. Value is such a powerful word. We speak so much about growth and that sort of perpetual going after more and more and more. What about if we were thinking more about value, thinking about flow rather than action and drive and focus and outcomes and delivery? What if we were thinking more about flow? How would that feel in a more conscious space? Connecting with our sensing. So we talk a bit about emotional intelligence and feelings, and that's growing slowly, not fast enough in our organizational spaces. But what if we were to just expand that a little bit and think about how we are connecting on a sensing level, an energetic level, using our awareness in a slightly different way? And work often tends to be a very dirty word. We're all working because we have to. What if work were to become a much more sacred word? One where it is about service and joy and contributing to something that is the greater good. So language is really important in how we show up as conscious leaders. This is just an example of one of those cards, and the kind of stimulus that comes with each quality and each aspect of a quality, and the coaching questions. Not expecting you to read those now, but just to be aware that this is what exists. So I want to open it up, either through the chat, if that's a more comfortable place, and there are a few comments there, and or if you have something else you'd like to contribute in a spoken sense. So when you think about everything that we've touched into here, what feels like, what's the stretch in this, either for you or for your organization as you experience it at this point? Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. What if time became our currency we navigate with? Exactly. Time is a currency. It's a resource. It's something, actually, if we think about it in terms of space, has a much bigger expansion field. The more aware we become, the more conscious we become, the more we move into space rather than time, just the limitations of time. We shift our attitude. Much more becomes possible in the space of consciousness and connecting with space, because we're not doing everything ourselves. We're influencing the field, the energetic field. We're into quantum physics in this space, and maybe in our spring session we'll do a little bit more around quantum physics in the context of consciousness, because that could be quite interesting. Right, does anyone think that somebody just find it hard to say what they really think for fear it may be misinterpreted? Yeah. which means they can be careful with their words, and it changes the meaning of what they wanted to say. I think particularly when we start to move into this space of consciousness, it takes a lot of courage to bring some of these slightly more subtle, ethereal words in. But what if we were to experiment with that a little bit more? We find that actually people respond very positively to it, and there's almost a kind of sense of relief that we can open up a different conversation, and one that has more meaning and reality to it. I'm very mindful that people are needing to jump off, so let me just wrap up here and finish with the last couple of thoughts. One, to bring us back to the Laloux quote, remembering that the impact we want to have in an organization has got to come from the way in which we as leaders in those organizations, particularly positional leaders, but not only, the way in which we behave and the way in which we express ourselves. And I'm not necessarily a huge fan of all things Jack Ma has to say, but I did quite like this quote, which is, when you change, the world changes. Back to that co-creative piece that we spoke about right at the beginning. And therefore it is about changing ourselves. And if we want to see a better world, we've got to get involved in it, and we've got to wake up to the consciousness of people, wake up the consciousness of people. And anybody who is just even half a step ahead in this world journey, is really important that we play our part in that process, and that we take that responsibility fully on the chin. So thank you to everybody who has been with us in the webinar today, and for your contributions and inputs into the chat. Very, very helpful. Thank you. The recording of this will be available to you afterwards, so we'll make sure you know where to get that if it's helpful to you. And wishing you a really conscious and aware day, and hopefully this will stimulate at least maybe one more shift in each of our individual journeys, me included. So with love to all, and join us for the next one, which is on the new economy in business in November. Bye for now.